When you hear the word Renaissance, you may think of Michelangelo, William Shakespeare, or men wearing swords, capes, and interesting hats. Or you may think of a modern Renaissance woman or man who is dressed in their education, their interests, and their accomplishments. Welcome to Book of Loretta, the life of a Renaissance woman from Cameron Parish, Louisiana. Hi everyone, this is Charles McNeely from DevDoc Theater. And what does Cheniere Pardue stand for?
Cheniere is an oak ridge.
An oak ridge and Pardue.
Pardue is lost because the only way to get there was by boat through the Montreal River. Okay. One of the first memories was the flood of 1940. There was a boat at home, and the Basigalapi family worked for us, and they would come in a wagon and go in the field to pick up peanuts. And I rode with them one day. I can remember riding in that. I must have been, what, 4 years old. And riding in the boat, and they'd pick up the peanut plants, you know, and put them in the boat. Then back at the house, we had a two-story, the old house was two-story. They brought the green peanuts up there to dry out. The next thing I remember well was when Franklin Roosevelt died. The reason I remember it so well, for some reason, was we had a radio. And we were one of the only people with a radio, and people would come home to hear the news. And so we would sit around, you know. By that time I had a little brother, Frank. I was 4 years older than him. But we would sit there and listen to the radio too, you know, because it was, and I remember them talking about his dog Fala. And then they talked about the fact that he died with his secretary with him, which he was supposedly having an affair. But I remember my grandmother saying, oh, she didn't want to hear about that.
And what, your parents, what was your father and mom's name?
My father's name was Sidney Louis Theriot, and my mother was Alva Wilhite Theriot. And both brothers, I had two brothers, one named Frank Sidney, and the other one was Sidney Louis. So we had
a big name in your
big name in the family, yes.
And your grandparents were there too. What is their name?
My grandfather was Adolphe Theriot. And my grandmother was Claudia Ernestine Mobile Theriot. My grandfather was one of the first white settlers there. He had a home in Lake Arthur, Louisiana, and cattle, and he needed grazing land for it. So he got in a boat and came down the Montreal River to the end of Cheniere Pardue, walked across and claimed the land. He floated our house. The old house, he demolished it, floated it down the Montreal River, and rebuilt it on. Brought the cattle, brought his house and his family. And he had a cattle empire. Well, my grandfather was Acadian, actually, his great-great-grandfather. But they came to Acadia from Strasbourg, okay. But my grandmother's family, the Mobiles, were from Pau, France. And her father, Jean, he boarded a boat in Bordeaux, France. He and 6 other guys, they just decided to come. They were not Acadians or whatever. Okay. They just came to New Orleans. In New Orleans, he met a runaway from New Hampshire. Oh my goodness. And married. They had 6, 7 children. And my grandmother, there was only one other girl. There were 2 girls in the family. Okay. And my grandmother went to school in Franklin, Louisiana. Okay. And so my grandfather, Adolphe Theriot, was already established on Cheniere Pardue, had been married, his wife died in childbirth. So he was driving cattle to New Orleans and stopped off in Franklin, Louisiana, and met my grandmother. And they married, and She came to live on Chenier Purdue, but never did go back to France. But she always told me that when I was old enough, I had to go to France. And now my grandmother would get like 3 or 4 newspapers sent. They came by mail. Yeah, and she was very well read. She knew how to do many things. She taught me how to sew and crochet. I was just a little girl, but we would sit on the swing and she would teach me my prayers in French or the alphabet in French. And then she had storybooks that we would read in French. And no one else in the family did. She and my grandfather conversed sometimes in French, but I never spoke French with my mom, my dad, or anyone else. Yeah. Except the other grandfather, Villiard, he didn't speak any English. Really? And I could speak, but I didn't want my friends to know I spoke French, you know, whatever.
So they didn't know anything about
No.
that.
At the school, the Creole school, there was this little wooden bookcase. It had 2 glass doors. Bessie Rutherford was Miss Rutherford. And I don't know what grade she taught. I'd just go sit in her classroom because there was a library, but it was in the high school part.
Okay. Yeah.
And so we weren't able to use the library, but I knew she had those books in there. And so I would finish my work with the teachers. And Miss Garber, that was Miss Lady Richard, who was my favorite teacher. But they would let me go and sit. I'd always say, "Can I go now?" And go, and I'd sit. And Mr. Wilson Monte was teaching there at the time. Later, he was a principal. He saw me sitting there. I didn't know that, but when I went the day I told him I was leaving school, I was quitting school, he made me take my books home with me, because he said, "You'll be back." And I said, if I come back, the only way I'll come back is if I'm a teacher. Never thought I'd be a teacher.
Right.
But when I did come back, he was a superintendent of schools. And I went in his office to sign a contract, and I saw the bookcase. The bookcase was there.
He had Mrs. Rutherford's
and I said, "That's the old bookcase." And he told me it was the only thing they'd saved out of Hurricane Audrey. And he had it in there, and you could still see we had to have ink bottles at that time, you know. Yeah. You could see where the ink bottles had been at the top. And so, but he told me, he said, "When I retire, I'm giving it to you if you want it." And wasn't many years after that, one day a truck appeared at my house, and they had the bookcase on it.
Man of his word.
And I kept that bookcase in my living room until Rita. When my granddaughter was little, Megan, she was rocking in a rocker and rocked back, and she cracked the window on it. And she remembers that.
How old were you at that point?
16, 17.
Okay, still a teenager.
My grandfather had a townhouse on Royal Street. Yeah, in the corner. And we would go. These 2 old ladies, had this little bitty perfume shop. The shop was a watch repair shop on one side, perfume on the other. And I would go in there, and there's 2 old ladies, Miss Marguerite and and we called her Aunt Bessie. Okay. And they were there, and they made their own perfume. Wow. But Marguerite, of course, had learned from a man named Auguste Dusson, who was a perfumer, had come to New Orleans. Wow. Okay. She worked with him as his assistant, whatever. Okay. And she had about, maybe 6 varieties. They didn't have a lot.
A lot, but they were good.
Yeah, they good. And I just would spend all my time in there, and they'd put this unscented musk oil. I still use it to...
What was it about that shop? Was it the smell? Was it the just learning about how...
There was just something. I was in there, and they just took me under their wings, you know, more or less. But the perfume was very crude, because there were cork bottles, you know.
Sure,
and just,
yes.
It was the smell, you know. I had never been perfumed before. Chenier Purdue had cow manure, and that was about it. Yeah. It was just so fascinating. They sold their perfume in little bitty tiny bottles, and they had one called Voodoo Love.
Voodoo Love.
Voodoo Love, and it had a little stopper and a thing, and you'd put it on. Well, I was totally fast. So every chance I got to go to know, I went to that shop. So then Miss Cairo she had a granddaughter. And Aunt Bessie was going blind. She was losing her sight. And the granddaughter was not interested in perfume very much, you know. So that was the only person, well, except the daughter, the mother of the granddaughter. She worked with them some, you know, but they were losing someone to carry on the thing.
Right.
And the old ladies wrote nothing down. They didn't want their formulas to be known, you know.
Of course, yes.
So on some of these trips, I've met Alessandra, the granddaughter, you know.
Yes.
And so we would go in that shop, and I smelled it so much I knew what it smelled like.
Yes.
So at one point, Miss Cairo had dementia.
Okay.
So they called me one summer to come over. They had to do something with the business, and I knew how it smelled. So we began mixing. Over the years, you know, we just worked at it the best we could. She and her mother continued the shop in New Orleans. When I had to go to school, I had a family, I had this.
Yes.
And then it got to the point where Alessandra's mother couldn't work anymore. By that time, though, I was married. I had the children and so forth. But I would go on weekends to see work at it until I decided, much later, that I was going to have a shop of my own. But I worked in the New Orleans. They became the Bourbon French Perfume Company when they died.
That was the name. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so when it became the Bourbon French Perfume Company, I became part of it. We worked like that for a long time until I was teaching, you know, and so forth. And when my husband and I separated, she called and said, "You've got to come here. We've got to do something." So with the shop, and it was there in the French Quarter. I left Creole, French Quarter, and I went over there. When I was in the perfume business, I involved my family, you know, and my niece, I took her with me to New Orleans, and she was trained too, somewhat in the, and so I needed someone to work in my shop, you see, because I'm a teacher and I have a shop, you know. I did perfume research for a doctor in New York. He thought I had a lab. He didn't know I did it on my living room coffee table. Right. He would go to Paris and other places and get all the new perfumes. They were also going through the process of copies. You could buy copies of perfumes.
Yes, yes.
And so he would send me this bag of perfume, little samples. I didn't know which ones they were numbered. And what I had to do was I was supposed to have a group of women who would try these perfumes and write it up, how long does it last. Well, I didn't have a group of women. I was teaching, but I had a lot of students. So I brought the samples to school. Oh, they loved doing this.
Of course.
You'd see them going, smelling their arms, you know, and they would write it up for me. So that was a writing assignment, you know. And he would pay me for, you know, the different things. I'd give them money. And one time he was coming down here to see my lab. I didn't answer him.
Right.
That was my coffee table and my classroom.
Exactly.
And I was contacted by this author, Jennifer Blake, by the name of, and she had written a book called Perfume of Paradise. And could I make paradise perfume? I had never met her. And she sent me a copy. Her real name's Patricia Maxwell. She lives near Ruston, Louisiana. She wrote 1 or 2 books as Maxwell. Then she took the name Jennifer Blake. So I did. I made a perfume for as well as I could read the character in the book, you see. So then it was how we were going to package it and so forth. So in this shop, I still had some of the old stuff from the old perfume shop.
Right. And
I found a whole case of little perfume bottles with flowered shape. They were adorable, with a cork at the top. By that time, I had met Jennifer Blake. And we met in a little restaurant called Leah's, and I forget what town, but we didn't want anybody to know who we were, you know. And while we were in there, I'd brought the perfume, and I reached across like this, and one hooked on my bracelet, and it crashed on the floor. and the most wonderful smell. She had a load of books in her trunk, and I had a box of perfume. We sold it all right there that day. And then so we decided that we're going to sell the perfume with the book. An ounce of perfume, you get a book, you see.
That's wonderful.
Because the perfume was much more expensive.
Yes.
So guess who? Dolly Parton got a book in perfume because I met her hairdresser.
Really?
And he bought Dolly Parton and Jane Sawyer.
Oh, was it Diane?
Diane Sawyer.
Okay, yeah. Goodness, Dolly Parton and Diane Sawyer.
They each got perfume for Christmas. Well, Danielle Steele, the writer, would come in. There were a lot of people in New Orleans. Miss Truman, we made I have a letter from Mrs. Truman.
President Truman's wife, Bessie Truman.
Bessie Truman. I have a letter from Bessie Truman. Larry liked to cook, so he went to culinary school while
Sure.
Kenneth went to Sweden and was on the Nobel Prize Committee, helping to pick the Nobel Peace Prize. And so they'd be gone nearly all summer.
Sure.
Would I stay in their house? And oh boy. The upstairs had it had its own little library. They had a little kitchenette up there. Oh, I loved it, you know. All I had to do was stay in their house. And
Yes.
So I did that. And then it got to where whenever I'd have to come back to New Orleans, I'd just go stay there. But one day, I went in one of the rooms, and there was like graffiti all over this room, like people writing stuff on the wall. And I asked Kenneth, I said, "What's in that room over there? Why is this all that graffiti on that room?" And he said, "That's the only room we kept in this house like it was."
Yes.
But I said, "How was it? What was it?" And then he told me, he said, "Have you ever heard of Blaze Starr?" I said, "Yeah." She was connected to Earl Long. I said, "Blaze Starr, yeah." He said, "This was our home." I said, "Really?" Yeah.
That is amazing. Now, you talked about leaving high school, and your principal saying, "Well, you'll be back." Well, the only way I'll be back is if I'm a teacher. How did you end up getting to college and getting a degree and a master's?
Leaving school, I moved to Alexandria, and I got married. He was in the Air Force, at England Air Force Base. Airmen didn't make much money, you know, so I knew I had to go to work. My father would send me money, but my grandmother died in January, my father in February, and my grandfather in March, the same year. We were living in Alexandria. They were building a new Sears store. And so I decided, well, I could go to work at Sears. So I walked in, it wasn't even opened yet. They were just taking applications. I had never seen an escalator in my life. And I was standing looking at this thing, and I'm wondering, is this how you get upstairs, you know? So I finally jumped on it and got upstairs, and I saw a line of people, you know, signing up for employment. And I thought, oh, they'll never hire me. I was little, I was a kid, yeah, I was probably 17 years old, I think. I was still young. And I went up and got an application, and I filled part of it out. And then I thought to myself, they'll never hire me. So I came back down the stairway, you know, and I was walking through this darkened store, and I heard a man say, "Hey, little girl." And I stopped, and he said, "You looking for someone?" And I said, "No, sir, I'm leaving." And he said, oh, he walked up to me. His name was Mr. Brown, and he told me he was the assistant manager. He said, "Is there something we can help you with?" And I said, I need a job. And he said, "Well, did you fill an application?" And I said, "I did. It's in my pocket." He said, "Let me see it." And so he said, "Well, what makes you think, why didn't you leave it upstairs?" And I said, "Because there are too many people, and I didn't finish high school, so you probably wouldn't hire me." But the next morning, he called me, and I got a job in the candy department. And I worked in that candy department until Audrey came. We came home to Shinny Party the weekend before, or the week before, because there was a cattle branding.
Okay.
and we felt like we needed to be there. And so the storm hit while we were there.
Really? Okay.
So, of course, I had to call, I ended up in Lake Charles, call Sears in Alexandria, and they said, just report to the Sears store in Lake Charles. And because they were doling out clothes and stuff to people.
Okay.
And so they said, just you stay there. And so I worked in the old Sears store. It was across from Muller's at that time, downtown. Yeah, and so I stayed there. I don't know, I worked there for a long time, but my husband got a job working in the golf until he decided to go to school. So we moved to Lafayette. Well, I told Sears in Lake Charles I'm moving to Lafayette, so they transferred me. Well, I started out in candy, but then they shipped me into at that time they had a money room where all the money would come through, you know, and you had to count it. And so I worked in there, and we were locked up in there all day. Then they transferred me to the credit department. And that's when they came out, the Sears revolving cards. That was the only charge card then. And you made the cards, you imprinted the cards and everything right there, you know, approved them, whatever. The store manager had told me, he said, I need to go back to school. And I said, how? You know, I didn't graduate, you know. But it so happened I went to pick up the mail one day, and I'd see this gentleman in there every time I went. And that one day he asked me why I wasn't in school. Or was I a student at school, perhaps. And I told him no, that I didn't graduate from high school, but, and he said, but you can still go to college. And I said, how? He would have me take the college entrance exam, take a seat in this auditorium, whatever. And I did, and I handed it to, I had no trouble with the test, you know. And I had to wait, he told me to wait. Just had to sit, you know, and wait. And then he told me, he came out and he said, you can go to college. And I said, oh, really? I told him, I said, but I can't go to school now. And he said, well, you know, why not? I said, because I have to work, my husband's going to school. Well, if ever you need to go, you can. So about that time, he finished up in Lafayette, and my husband, and we moved back to Shinyaparty. Oh, I was really discontented there. No more jobs, there's no Sears store, no UL. And I decided one day, I'm going back to school. I am going to school. So I teamed up with 3 ladies from home, and we all decided to go to school, come to McNeese. And one of them, Bootsy, we called her Bootsy Carter. Her name was Olga. So then we had 2 other ladies that decided to come. So the 4 of us, we had a ball here at this university. I heard her, I was walking in one of the halls here at McNeese. Ms. Benoit, D'Olive Benoit was her name.
What did she teach?
French.
Oh my goodness.
And I told her bonjour when I walked by, you know, and she answered me, and then she motioned for me to come, and she asked me if I was a student at McNeese, and I said, not yet, I was in the process, you know. But I said, I'm going to study French. And I did. I had her for many semesters, you know, Miss D'Olive Benoit, I remembered her. So then, and with my master's, I heard some professors talking, and I heard one of them say, I wish we could find Loretta. Is there something wrong? And they said, yeah, we need to tell you something. They were on the board with the oral exam. Okay. And they said, you're exempt from taking the oral. I almost passed out because I had 2 classmates who had failed it. And so I'm like, when and it was scheduled, you see. Yeah. And she said, I don't remember the teacher's name, but she said, you're not going to have to take it.
Well, you earned it. So,
yeah. So when I went to school in Montreal, one night, a friend and we decided to go they were having a lobster war. So we decided to go have some lobster. So we walk into this one place, and I heard, New Orleans! And this man come up to me, and he said, New Orleans, my perfume. I had made a perfume, a cologne.
And he remembered you?
Yes, come in, come in. He ran for his bottle, and he was showing everybody his bottle. He was the owner of the restaurant. And his wallpaper in there was really unique. It was all little bitty bottles of perfume. So I ate there
in Montreal, Canada,
and he I didn't remember him, of course, but he had my bottle. He kept by the register, you know, and he was showing everybody. It was so funny, you know.
That is.
Yeah. So.
What a wonderful moment. Now, another thing that I'm curious about, and you kind of talked a little bit about it with me in the past, the Geophysical Survey Company. How did that?
I was a general manager. Well, okay, I was in Mexico probably in 2002 or three, I think. Okay. I was with Monsignor Bourke, and I got a call from Mr. McCall telling me that I need to come back. And I said, why? And he said, I need you here with the survey company. And I'm like,
but why would he call you?
Well, we were good friends, and we had been friends, and I knew a lot about the boats and all that stuff.
So you had a little background in it.
He had fired everybody. There was this one lady left, and so she was there waiting for me to get there so she could leave, you see. Okay. And but she and I bonded before she left, you know, because I figured I'm going to need you. Yeah. Cecile Lejeune. Okay. And I called her Cece. We had to map out all the blocks, and I had to do all of this, so, you know. But Cecile was invaluable. She sopped up that stuff, but she wasn't working. Right. And so I would email everything. Email came up about that time. How perfect. Oh yeah, so I'd email this and say, help me set this up, Cece, and we worked together. I don't know if Mr. McCall knew it or not, but we did, and he just thought I did fabulous work, you see. So, but the test came when we had to do a pipeline, and I'm like, I don't know how to do a pipeline. I know how to do straight lines, you know. And so he had an office on the other side of the building, and there was a man in there, and he asked me, he said, do you need something? And I said, I need to know how to map out a pipeline, how to set up the lines for a pipeline. And both of them just looked at me. It had a curve in it. Got you. Yeah. And so he sent the guy that was with him, worked for another company in Lafayette, and he knew all about pipelines. So he came to my office and he sat there with me and showed me how to start. That's amazing. Right place at the right time. Yeah, but it's still very, I mean, these are $1 million jobs, you know. Right. So I called, and they wanted it right away. So I called Cecile and I said, I'm emailing you something. We sat up all night and worked on setting up that pipeline. We had to figure out, you know, all the... Right. We stayed up all night, and but I made the booklet. The boat left with everything, and we just prayed. Yes. And it worked. That is amazing. It worked. Yeah. And then when, in 2005, when the storm hit, I loaded, by that time there were backup discs, you know, and jump drives. And luckily. I put everything on that. All the jobs that I had coming and so forth, and I just downloaded. No, they were in the computer, and I just downloaded everything. Gotcha. And then we put my computers on put them on one of the boats, and he had to take all the boats out here to the port of Lake Charles. But the survey boat was in Mobile, in Mobile Bay. That's a good ways away. It stayed there, yeah. Yes. Okay. So whenever I needed to get something to the boat, I would send it to my friend in Mobile, and they'd come on shore and go to her house and get the parts for the boat or whatever they needed, you know. And I was in Lafayette. I went there from Rita. Didn't know what had happened to my house or anything. Yeah. And so I called one of the gentlemen that I was doing a job for, and Dean Eldoragi, and he had a small geophysicist. He was a geophysicist. And he said, I have an office. You can come here and set up. So I set up the office and ran the company from Lafayette. From his. And he could do my reports, and we could send them to MMS. Nice. Yeah. So not even Rita could stop me. No, I went to work. We went to work, and we did those pipelines, you know, that was, I was amazed when I'd see them come back. The pictures, you know, it looked like spaghetti. And there were no banks. Oh, that's right. The Cameron banks, the Lake Charles banks, everything was... because the banks go through New Orleans. Because Katrina and then Rita. But I had an account at the Jeff Davis Bank. Nice. My personal account. Yes. So I had to run everything through there. the oil companies had left New Orleans, like
Yes.
they were in Houston and Dallas,
Yes.
and they were setting up shop there. And so I remember when we got the first $1 million check. I'd never seen $1 million before. I had to go to Lake Charles and get it out of the post office. And I was tickled. $1 million,
yes.
you know. I got this letter from Edwin Edwards telling me that they were sending these people from Louisiana to the Louisiana Bicentennial in Paris. 1976, and I was the one to go from Cameron Parish.
That's amazing.
And they sent Geneva Griffith with
Yes.
me. We rode the train from Paris to Pau.
Yeah.
And when we had to come back to Paris, we were in this little car, you know, and there was a man sitting across from us who never spoke a word the whole trip, and he sat cross-legged, had this, he looked like the typical Russian, you know, we saw then.
Yeah.
Big eyebrows, he had a roll neck sweater.
Yes.
And she wouldn't, if she wanted to talk to me, she'd write it. And then, or we had to go to the bathroom so she could tell me what she wanted. And all our suitcases were above our heads. So when we got to Paris, we had to pull the suitcases down, you see. And I didn't know how I was going to do mine. And this man across, he reached over and got my suitcase, took off with it.
What?
Yes, but it was fine because he took off down the aisle, you know, in the train. There was a lot of passengers waiting to get off. I could see him through the window. He got a red cap, he had a little platform deal, and he put my suitcase on it. And by that time I'd reached the door. And I went up to the man and I said, "Thank you." And he said, "Think nothing of it," in English. I bet he laughed at us the whole time, you know.
Yes, I would imagine.
But we had a wonderful time. I was glad they had sent her along with me, you know.
What were the landmark moments of your writing career?
I always kept a diary, and I wrote all the time. I wrote, just write. But I never thought about I'm going to write a book or anything of that sort. And I took this course with a Mr. Marcello. Leo Marcello.
I remember Leo. Great man.
I loved Leo,
Beautiful man.
and we had to keep a book in there, kind of like a journal, you know, and so forth. During while I was in one of his courses, there was a murder in Cameron. And I wrote in there about the murder.
And that was the book.
The book.
That became The Calling.
Yeah, The Callings. And I was teaching also at the time, and these two boys were in my class, in separate classes. But I told him that, I said, you know, for the first time in my life, I feel like writing a book. And he said, write it, do it. And then he also told me that he was writing a couple books and so forth. So I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And I still have his notes that he sent me, because he died not long after that. Right. One year, I was in France. When I got home, they told me at the post office that there was a lady from Mobile who was looking for me, and she wanted to write a book. In my classes, I had one boy, the one who eventually, Jean Roux, and in the other one I had Johnny Savoy. And so they were not friends, but they crossed, and Johnny always looked after Jean in some way or another. So this woman, eventually I contacted her. Okay. And by this time, Johnny is a priest, and he's in Mobile, Alabama. Okay. Jean is in prison in Angola. Okay. So Jean writes to Johnny and tells him about the wages of sin. Well, Mary Palmer was in the audience, I mean in the church, in the congregation, and she heard this and decided to write a book. So she tells Johnny, the priest. Johnny's folks lived in Creole, Cameron, between Cameron and there was a little church here, St. Rose of Lima. And so that particular Sunday I went, Johnny was there visiting his parents, saying Mass. And so he told me, he said, this lady in Mobile, in the parish where I'm the pastor, wants to write a book. And he said, you need to contact her. Well, give me her name, whatever. So I contacted her and came back down here. In the meantime, the lawyer that had conducted this lost, you know, when he was convicted, the boy. I still don't believe he killed his mother, though. But this lawyer had had a stroke. He couldn't speak. But I knew someone else here in Lake Charles who knew him, and they told him that I was interested in writing a book. So he called me and said, any of my law stuff that you can use, you can come to my office and make copies. So I called the lady in Mobile, and she came, and for one weekend we copied everything out of there, you know, and so forth. And then he couldn't talk. The only thing he told us was, get that boy out of prison. I wrote the first half of the book. She wrote this more or less. She was a little more philosophical than I was. I wrote about, because I was familiar with the boys and everything. We went to go to Angola to see Gene, you know, but we didn't know you had to be on the visitors list, okay? So we drove, and that was the time where the beepers, everybody was using the beepers.
Right, yes.
So I told one of my students at school I was going to Angola. I didn't know that to use a beeper, you got to beep, and then you had to have a phone, you see. I had no idea what this beeper does, but I was going to get a beeper to go to Angola. Okay. So I borrowed her a beeper, put it in my pocket. We went to Angola, Mary and I. Well, guess what? You get to the gate and you have a visitor's pass. No, we didn't, you know.
Right.
And so we couldn't go in. So Mary comes back to the car and says, what do we do? I said, I don't know. So I said, well, we're here. We've got to go see him.
Right.
So she's a Eucharistic minister in her church. So she goes to the guardhouse and tells them that we're Eucharistic ministers, and we came to bring communion. So they waved us in. We're in Angola, okay?
Right. Yes.
And they bring Gene and one of his friends and so forth, and we talk. And he remembered me by my perfume.
Wow.
From the teacher at school. But listen to this, while we're talking, we got a tour of Angola. We went to the death room, you know, where they do and my beeper goes off. And I'm like, they didn't even take that away or anything. I had no idea what to do with it, and I'm like,
yes, of course.
And then the boy asked me, he said, is that a beeper? And I'm like, yes, you know. Yes. But it finally stopped. I mean, it was beep, beep, a little bit and stuff. Yeah. But I got into Angola with a beeper. But all the evidence was destroyed, you know. There's a lot to that story, so. But we got it before, I got a lot of it before. I had the kids at school helping me and all kinds of stuff, you know, so it was good.
You are a writer right now for the Cameron Pilot newspaper.
This is how it happened, okay, that I was always familiar with the Cameron Pilot. Sure. And Jeffra used to come. Now, Jeffra is the owner now. When I had my perfume shop in Creole, she would come in there and they did the advertisements, you know, and everything. So, but this is what happened. Before the hurricane, before Rita, this publishing company contacted me and they wanted a book of short stories. Like I'm working on, you know, and I'm not teaching anymore, I'm working. I contacted my friend Mary Palmer in there and I said, yeah, a book of short stories. It could be on any subject, whatever, but I told her, I said, you want to work with me on this, or let's work on this together, okay? So we were going to call it commas for life or something, you know, you need, like writing, you need commas and periods and question marks. And you have the same thing through life, you know, and different stories are like commas. Love that title. So I did 15 stories and she did 15 stories. Okay, that was before the hurricane. So I made a CD of my stories and her. We'd do it over, we'd email back and forth, you know, and that's how we wrote the book too. But that was the first book with my name on it because I didn't want all the others to be. So anyway, but this commas, it was commas for soul seekers, kind of like soup for the soul, you know, whatever. Yes, absolutely. So I copied all my stories on a CD. At the time, you didn't have the jump drive. And then the storm hit. But we never heard any more from the publisher or anything until about 2 years ago. About 2 or 3 years ago, this publisher suddenly is interested in commas. But we had sent him the CD,
Years ago,
whatever.
Like 2005.
Yeah, she calls me and tells me that she's been notified or called by them saying that they're interested in the book. They called me and said there was something wrong with the material that we had submitted. All my stories were missing. Well, guess what? It was just that time Jeffrey calls and says, Loretta, is there any way that you could write some articles for the paper? And so I tell her about this story, and I said, yeah, I got a whole lot of stories. Oh, in the meantime, I looked for this box at home. I remember the box of CDs, and the whole thing's on there. My stories, all everything.
There.
But the book was published. Well, anyway, I said, I'll be glad to write some stories. But then I published a couple of those stories on the paper, but a short story and a newspaper article was Tuesday. Yeah. So it took 3 newspapers to get a story in, you know. Right, yeah. So I said, Jeffrey, I'll write you some other stories, you know. I do book reviews for authors. I saw that. I have thousands of books. In fact, my son Luke bought me a little temporary building outside. I had so many, and I get the books. I get 3 or 4 books a week, you know. They send me for reviews.
Sure. The publisher sends it to you?
The publisher and the authors both. But some of them I want. You know? And then one morning, well, during 9/11, you know, they were having they were redoing this, and they were interviewing a woman, or a couple women rather, but this one had written a book, and she wrote this book about her husband before he died in one of the planes. And but she said a week or so before he died, it's like he had a premonition he was going to die. Yeah. And he kept telling her to prepare for this and take care of that and different things. And so the morning that this happened, she knew instantly her husband had died. Okay. And so after he died, I mean after all this, you know, she would feel like she was doing something and she'd feel like he was standing beside her. Or she went through this and she began thinking, I wonder if anybody else feels this. Now I'm watching her on TV. And so she began interviewing the women who lost husbands during this time, if they were having similar experiences, and they were. And sort of like visitations.
Everyone from the 9/11
that she spoke to, yeah, the women.
Who had this
like,
sensation.
Yeah, of being visited with the dead from beyond. And she wrote this book. She wrote the book. And I'm watching her on TV, and I'm like, well, I'd like a copy of the book. Well, guess what? I go to the mailbox, and there's a copy of the book in the mailbox.
For you to review?
Yeah, I have to review. Yeah, my granddaughter is a designer for Stellars. Okay. And Stellars is building a library inside of the Stellars factory for their workers. I told Megan, my granddaughter, I said, I'll donate these books to the library because they're new, they're not, yeah, and they're the genres that, all kinds, you know. I like doing the book reviews, and of course I give the books to whoever wants because I don't have to mail them back or anything. And I get a lot of them on e-books too. Got you. Okay. Kindles.
Sure, yes.
One day I counted 12. Oh, I could hear them click, click, you know, they just download. Yes. I got 12.
You do a lot of reading. Oh my
I do.
Gosh. And a lot of writing. So.
Yeah, I read, and my dogs, I got 2, you know, it's such a life. But it's the first time in my life that I didn't have to work, that I don't have a job.
You can do